I'd like to address a question that I'm often asked, or at least should come up when talking to people about collecting their own water from fog. And that question revolves around why are you collecting the water from fog and what should you do with it? My first response would be most of what I do is research. So the reason I'm collecting water from fog is to get a better understanding of how much water we can get from fog in terms of maybe what we'd need to use it for. In order to know how much water we're getting from fog, we need to be able to measure the water we're getting. Now, one way to do that, of course, is to have some sort of a barrel or bucket placed at the end of the trough from which water is being collected from the fog collector. The water drips down into the trough, as you might know, runs down the trough, and then goes into some sort of a vessel where it can be stored, measured, or whatever you'd like to do with that water. Now, my recommendation is not just to store that water. If you can store it, that's great. But to use storage as a mechanism for measurement is somewhat limited, and I'm going to tell you why. I think it's a great way to measure it if you have no other way to do it. But you need to make sure you have a large enough storage tank. If it's just a 5-gallon container or something like that, and you happen to have a heavy fog event and a 1 square meter of mesh, you could potentially exceed that 5-gallon capacity, and you wouldn't know how much water you got, except you'd be able to say it was at least 5 gallons. So that's one reason why it's better not to just have some sort of a small bucket or something that's used to collect and measure the water. Of course, if you get 5 gallons, you're doing really well. Not all sites are going to get that. The other reason why I recommend not using some sort of a vessel that collects the water alone is that water can leave due to evaporation, so you could have some loss, although probably not a lot, but some if the day gets hot after the fog lifts and if some of the water evaporates away, reducing the amount you have. Your accuracy is a little harder to ascertain than if you have other methods that I'll mention. If you just have a big bucket, so you accurate to the fraction of a liter, or how accurate are you? It comes down to the question of how accurately you can read the level of water that's in the measurement device. Finally, you don't know when that water. So you have to measure at the same time of day. You have to go out and look at how much water is in the vessel that you're accumulating the water in. So if you're doing it at a different time of day, there may have been more fog that happened, so you're not getting exact during part of the day when you're measuring it. So you're not getting the exact daily cycle that you'd get if you were going at the same time every day. And even then, you're only getting the daily cycle. You're not going to be able to see the water on a finer scale, like hourly or even finer. So my solution to that is not to use a collection vessel in order to measure the amount of water, although if you want to collect the water for whatever reason, that could be a good thing. But my suggestion is to use some sort of a rain gauge, or something that can record the amount of water that passes through on some sort of a regular basis. Could be hourly, could be every few minutes. You'd need a rain gauge, which is something that basically most rain gauges, which is what meteorologists use to measure rain, they have a little device in there that tips every time a certain amount of water falls into it. And as it tips, it records the number of times that it tips. It sends that information to something called a data logger that puts a timestamp on it, or at least tells you how many tips happen within a certain time interval. And each time the water tips, the next cup comes up, it fills with water, and eventually tips. Next cup that the original cup comes up, so usually there's two buckets that are on a kind of a seesaw that go up and down like that. And each tip is recorded, and the volume of water is recorded, or is known for a given rain gauge. And then you can use that to assess how much water has actually been collected by the fog collector over a given time interval. One thing I do is I calibrate all of my rain gauges regularly, usually every year, so that I know how much water each tip represents. Because even for the same type of rain gauge, each tip may be slightly different. So it's important to have some sort of a calibration so you know what that is. And sometimes that number can change for a variety of reasons. Usually it stays fairly consistent. For instance, it's usually, for the type of rain gauge I use, about 8 milliliters of water, or 8 thousandths of a liter per tip. And I know the time during which those tips take place, so I have a very accurate view of what the amount of water was that was collected from a given fog collector at a given location. So that's my recommendation. If you're going to the effort of constructing a fog collector, you're probably going to want to have some way to measure the amount of water you're getting. And my recommendation is to use some sort of a rain gauge. You could use water storage, but a rain gauge is going to give you more accuracy, better precision, and more reliability, and more security and less manual intervention than having to go every single day or regularly to look at how much water is accumulated from your fog collector.